Okay, good morning. It's been a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank again Ali and Alex for inviting me over and for organizing this nice talk. So I will try, like other people, I will use the title of this workshop, and facing the challenge of trying to understand how selection shapes diverse animal minds, I thought maybe to zoom out a bit and to think how selection shapes diverse animal adaptations in general. So if we take, for example, a textbook case like how selection shape diverse leg morphologies in insects. So usually you have kind of a basic formula of basic segments, and selection shape, they modify them gradually to do different jobs. So if you look, for example, here, we have some genetic modification that extends some segments and make the grasshopper be able to have very good jumping ability, or mole crickets have digging ability, and lice have, gripping ability. And for us, it is quite intuitive to see how small modification can really change this segment gradually and make them good for something. Okay, because we understand the physics, we understand the morphology, there's no magic in it. If we want, we can also add some behavioral test and, test the grasshopper for just jumping ability or the mole cricket for digging and so on. But in many cases, it's not really needed. I mean, the intuition is very clear. There's no magic in how small modification can make the ability that we are interested in. Now, but if we go back to cognitive abilities and how selection shapes diverse animal cognitive abilities, here sometimes we face with the other direction. We start with some kind of a behavioral test. And we assume that this kind of behavioral test, for example, discrimination tests, tell us something about learning ability, or reversal tests tell us something about cognitive flexibility. And if we have animals that pass the ephemeral reward test, it means that it's really clever, like a cleaner fish or a parrot or an ape. So we view it as an advanced cognitive ability. And obviously, there's a lot of research, and we try to relate how genetic changes really generate these cognitive abilities. And as we have seen yesterday, there is a lot of progress in this. And we get, in many cases, people identify genes that really affecting and are responsible to these cognitive abilities. But in between, there's pretty much kind of a black box. How exactly this small modification gives the cleverness to these abilities or make them work? It's not entirely a black box. Of course, we have the brain here, And it's not even just the brain in general, but many studies were really focused on specific neuroanatomical structure in the brain and some wiring and some activities and connectivities. So we try to locate the black box the better way in some specific organs, but it's still not like the grasshopper example in the jumping ability. So there is a little bit, it's not really clear how by adding tissue to this area, you make the animal being able to solve the ephemeral reward task, for example, or how you make it, what is the secret of cleverness? Now, an alternative approach that some people take, and we have been doing it for the past few years quite a lot, is to think about that actually genes, what the main genetic modification, what they're doing, they modify basic learning algorithms and allow them to move from kind of simple associative network that relate, to associate item and object and action in the environment, and start representing the statistical relationship between things in the environment, creating some kind of a cognitive map, if you want. And this allows animals to navigate the way to food or away from predator. The numbers here are just, representing some real items. It's a model, so it's a conceptual model. By the way, all the networks that I will mention, they are not deep learning models. It's conceptual models which work a bit differently. But the idea is that when you modify learning algorithm, they eventually build some representation of knowledge that animals use this one to make decision. And of course, these networks have to be stored somehow in the brain. They have to be materialized by real tissue, by real organs, that are not just theoretical. But what really makes the animal clever is the learning algorithm that builds this network. And of course, later on, you need some genetic modification of the brain itself, because to the extent that there is demand for developing larger networks in some domain, or you need some neuroanatomical structure that will facilitate this, then mutation that release some constraint on the brain volume will promote larger brains or larger parts of the brain and so on. So it's more like that this morphology is kind of facilitating what the learning algorithms require. Okay, but it's not that if you just make a mutation and make a larger brain, it will make it clever. It's only if there is a demand for doing something with this brain, and then this facilitated. Now, when I say that we've been playing with it, I have to mention my main colleagues that were part of this is Joe Halperin, a computer scientist from Cornell, Shimon Edelman from the Department of Psychology at Cornell University, and Oren Kolodny, who used to be my student together with Shimon Edelman, who's now in faculty in the Hebrew University. And through the years, we published kind of a bunch of papers. Some of them are verbal arguments, some of them are explicit computer simulations, and for example, some of them deal with this computer simulation show how really you can, under what condition it will be adaptive to construct this kind of networks for animal foraging in a structured environment. It's not always adaptive, but sometimes when the environment becomes more and more structured and complex, it might be adaptive. And how you can use the same program actually as a language model and to do language acquisition and replicate studies in language acquisition, and how maybe you can get some perspective about animal creativity or gene culture coevolution and so on. Obviously, I'm not expecting you to read this paper over the weekend, but I will try to summarize just some of the main ideas that are more related to the kind of cognitive research that maybe some of you may be interested in. So, you know, when you start, you think about it, that even simple food cue association is a little network. Okay, you have some cues associated with food, so it's a very little simple network. If you go to the process of backward chaining, what people call second-order conditioning, it's already built. You know, you have, animals learn what is connected to what is connected with food, and by the process of backward chaining, animals start to have kind of a more rich representation of the statistical relationship of items in the environment, but it takes time to build it because every time you need, you know, we know that backward chaining will require a lot of training. But one interesting transition is when animals start to develop what we call continuous or unsupervised learning of the environment, just being in general motivated or curious about everything around them. And then they start to, you know, build kind of a cognitive map of statistical relationships. So by the time suddenly they realize that, I don't know, C is related to food, they already know how to navigate their way to there or how you can get there. And in some environment, it will be, you know, in the simulation, you can show that it starts to be adaptive. But an important transition is that you build the same continuous learning, but with chunking. And chunking, what I mean is that if you look on the element that build the network, the nodes in the network, they will not be just a single element like here represented by letters, but they will be themselves kind of a combination. Okay, you can call them, they are combinational elements. Some people call them configural, you know, this is what people talk about, non-elemental learning or configural learning. In some fields in psychology called chunk. It can be called sequence if really the sequential order is meaningful, like Johan mentioned yesterday. And it has many names. I will use chunking just as just one general name. But the thing is that, you know, the ability to represent configuration or chunks in the environment is that the environment really composed of many configurations. For example, this is one of the simulations we use for foraging, and you can assume that each letter represents some element in the environment, and this formation of this plant, for example, is associated with food, and this configuration is not. And when the environment is structured, it might be important to start constructing this complex network, and the same type of algorithm actually allow us to do what I mentioned before, like in language acquisition, because the combination of syllables, okay, it can give you words, the combination of words can give you some expression, and the same level of, you know, the same kind of algorithm can give you some level of language acquisition, at least at some level, if you allow for sequential learning. Now, but the main problem, if you think about it, is that when you start building large networks, and especially if you start thinking about configuration and chunking, is that you have exponential explosion of possibilities. There are many possible ways. It's like taking syllables and make them words. It's clear to us that you can have, you know, multiple ways how to do it. So there are many ways how to chunk different items, different element environment, and this number of chunks also determine how many type of networks you can build. You know, so there are many ways to do it. And the solution that we suggest is that actually the way to learn chunks, or to decide that some chunks are important, is if you meet, for example, this chunk 597, assuming this is a combination of elements, if the animals see it together again, like in associative learning, things happen together, fire together, wire together, they're connected. If they happen again and again and again, at some time window. For example, so we have memory weight. First time that you see this chunk, it gets a memory weight, but it is subjected to decay. You very quickly may forget it. But if it's come again, it's reached higher and higher weight. And if maybe after 3 times, it gets fixated in memory. Like when you learn a new phone number, or at least like we used to learn new phone numbers, you have to rehearse a few times, and then it gets fixated in your memory. The idea of this mechanism that it gives you some kind of a test of statistical significance. The point is that most things will be forgotten this way. So not all combinations will be learned, but things that are significant in the environment, maybe it's worth learning them because they are important element in the environment. Now, if you ask how many times that you need, this is exactly the parameters of the model. It is quite possible that under some important context, 1 time should be enough. In other cases, even 10 times may not be enough. So these are the parameters of the model. But why they are important? Because the parameters of the model really define what kind of chunks you will have in your memory representation and what kind of networks will develop. And the general claim we make in these models is that actually the fine-tuning of chunking may be a major target of selection during cognitive evolution. Because what genes may modify is that by just modifying this little parameter of learning, you get a very, kind of a developmental cascade that determine how the network will look like. And the network is what allows animals to actually to act upon and to make decisions and to behave. And I'll give you some examples. For example, if this is a portion of the network, and you have this kind of representation, and let's imagine that 7, 5, 6, and 3, 2, 1, they represent different items, and they're perceptually not similar, okay? They're not the same, but they have similar link structure. They are associated with similar things. So this can represent things that can be, can fly, or things that can be eaten, okay? You can make some generalization based on this common link structure, okay? By the way, this is how synonyms work in a language model, okay? But if, on the other hand, for some reason, the parameters of chunking or of data acquisition, the distribution of data input is different, the same data can give you a different network representation. In this case, these little chunks, this little item are actually locked within large, unique, idiosyncratic chunks, and then you cannot draw generalization like you can do here. So actually, the ability to work with the network really depends on this fine-tuning of this parameter. And the mechanism is very dynamic, and it's kind of fragile. If you don't fine-tune it the right way, with this network, maybe you'll be able to do other things very well, but not to generalize. Maybe you can have subroutines that are doing this automatically very good, but not other things. Now, if we try to go back and think about some implications for cognitive abilities, take some example. If you think about generalization, generalization, we used to define it as, it's not only the tendency to generalize based on similarity, but it also depends on what can be perceived as similar based on network representation. So even if you have the same tendency to generalize, with this network representation, it will be easy to generalize across these instances, and with this one is not. So it's not just the tendency to generalize, but what has been learned and how it is represented in memory that allow you to now use the rule of generalization to generalize. If you think, for example, on cognitive flexibility or creative problem solving, so the tendency to reverse or to change behavior when something doesn't work is not only about the tendency to do it, it also may depend on what alternative options are offered by the network. For example, if you used to go from here to here and to get what you need, and if it stopped working, if you have in your memory representation this alternative, then you can go and be flexible. So even if the same tendency to behave flexibly depends on what is available in the network that can that serve this flexibility. So more generally, I would say that for me, when people talk about cognitive abilities, I would say more kind of in general, like everything that animal can do with the network is the cognitive ability, or you say everything the network can do is the cognitive ability. It's the sum of a lot of projects, but it's not easy to pinpoint, when they really happen. Now, I have to admit that, relating all this high-level theory with the kind of research we're doing in my lab with house sparrows, with other birds, and learning, decision-making, social behavior, it's not straightforward. I used to say for many years that I have kind of a split personality. On the one hand, I'm playing with all this high-level modeling of cognitive evolution. On the other hand, I make my living as a behavioral ecologist, doing more kind of normal experimental work with birds and decision-making and so on. And in the paper I hope to write for the volume of this conference, I hope to use some examples from our research to see how they are related, but I thought that for this particular lecture, it would be better to use another example, how the fine-tuning of chunking may be a major target for selection during cognitive evolution. And this is a story about fish, a fish that many of you know. It's a very famous fish. It's the cleaner fish. And what you know is as the cleaner fish market problem or the ephemeral reward task. Cleaner fish, of course, this was a collaboration with Radwan Shari. If you work on cleaner fish, he has done some, I'm sure many of you are familiar with his remarkable work on many aspects of cleaner fish behavior. And, but the modeling itself, we did with Yosef Prat. He spent the postdoc with Radwan, and he did a lot of the simulation. And the paper actually published 2 years ago in PLOS Biology, so you can look into the details. But let me tell you the main story and why chunking is kind of so important in this case. Cleaner fish, as probably all of you know, they are little fish. They live in coral reef all over the world, and they make the living on removing ectoparasites from other larger fish in the reef. And usually they have kind of cleaning station, they have their kind of territory, and many fish come and sometimes wait in lines to be served. And actually the number of interactions they can have per day can be hundreds or even thousands. So they have a lot of decision to make during the day and many opportunities to learn. And they're doing some remarkable behavior and things, but one of the things that is really interesting is what, as we mentioned before, what we call the cleaner fish market problem or the ephemeral reward task. So what is the problem? In the reef, actually, cleaner may face 2 types of clients. Some of them, we call them resident because they have relatively small home range, and usually they have only one cleaning station of one cleaner, so they have nowhere to go. They really have to wait for this cleaner in the local environment to serve them. On the other, we have visitors. Usually these animals have larger home range and they're moving around. So if there is a lot of, there is a queue and if they're not served, they can go to another cleaning station. So the idea is that when a cleaner fish is faced with resident and visitor simultaneously, it should actually, if you go to the resident, okay, it will get a reward, but the visitor may go to another place. So it still gets a reward, it still gets a reward of 1. For the modeling, just say that, every time they remove an parasite, it's 1 and they're all equal to make it simple. But on the other hand, if it was choosing to go to the visitor first, then the resident could wait and it will get 1 and another 1, and together it will get 2. So the solution for the market problem is that when facing resident and visitor, choose visitor, the ephemeral reward first. And it looks quite simple, but apparently it is not so simple. It is not so simple. First, empirically, it seems that many animals, including even little children, find this task quite difficult. And also, as I'm going to show you, that theoretically, when you think about how learning models work, it's a bit challenging to solve this problem. And what I will try to show you first, that chunking is needed to solve this problem, at least the problem in its complex form in nature. And the chunking ability is not enough, but it must be adjusted to ecological condition. That this chunking parameter must be adjusted in order to be successful in using chunking in this problem. So why chunking is needed? Let's start with this. If you just try to use simple learning model, like reinforcement learning models, you can easily learn that our resident give you 1 and visitor give you 1, but each of them you just updated their value. You cannot learn that visitor is better than resident because normal, simple learning rules just update each of them independently. What you need is something a bit more sophisticated, and one of the things that immediately, you go and try to test is a model what we call extended credit, or it's like chaining. The idea that here, the credit for the first choice also, the reward from the second choice, from the resident, is going back to the first choice of the visitor. So going first to visitor is represented as equal to. Okay, it's like you make a move to go to visitor and you get a meal of 2, of 2 rewards. Okay, this actually, if you use this type of model to solve the simple market problem, when you face a resident and a visitor, it works. It works not bad. But the problem that in nature, you have many situations when you have 2 residents and 2 visitors. Now, in this case, if you have 2 residents, you go to the first resident, the other resident is wait. So going first to the resident, you learn that actually you can have 2. So the extended credit model in this case teach you that R equal 2. In this case, when you have two visitors, you go to one visitor, the other one may go away, so you learn that actually visitor give you 1. And when you average all what you learn together by all these three situations, this one reduced the value of V, this one increased the value of R, and overall they're kind of about average, and the model failed to develop a preference. So under realistic condition, this type of extended credit of chaining is not really enough. What you need is really to have a separate representation, like different chunks, that each of them separately, like again, like different words, like you don't mix car and pet with carpet. You know, just like in language is very intuitive for us to do, but you need to separate that each pair of situation or each sequence of actions have its own reward, and you don't mix them. Now, we actually showed this in a previous paper with Andres Quinones, Olaf Leymar, and Ardon Sherry, that we analyzed the cognitive requirements for solving the cleanup fish market task, and we showed that actually you need chunking in order to solve it. But in this case, because we didn't really model the chunking process explicitly, we couldn't show, why it must be adjusted to ecological condition and how possibly chunking is work. We only show that, if you have chunking, you can solve it. If you don't have chunking, you have a problem to solve the market problem in what we call the complex market problem. So here in this model, we try really to think, to consider how you do chunking. And you start with a model, a simple network model, and this is a model without chunking. So you have a node that represents visitor, resident, empty arena, this is X. You have some transitional probabilities for move from one state to another, and visitor is is associated with food, with certain link that represent its value. Resident also associated to food when we serve a resident. But again, this is the simple model. In order to have chunking, you need to add to this network representation another node that represents the sequence V, then R. And then V, then R is associated with a thicker line because VR gives you 2. And then if you learn this sequence, you may be able to prefer. But the question is how you do it. And the idea when you create, how animals make the decision to create a chunk. So the rule that we use in the model, and it's many other models, is that you create a chunk when V is followed by R more than expected by chance. But how much more? This is the parameter. It's the CP, the chunking parameter. It's like a chunking threshold. You can, after one time, decide that you learn a chunk, but you can wait until it is really more than expected by chance. Okay? It could be 10, 3, 13 times. So this is a parameter. Actually, this parameter in this model captures the more complex and realistic scenario in which the probability of creating chunks, it really is a combination of memory weight increase and decrease, like memory increase and decay, that eventually determine whether a chunk will be learned or not. The idea, this is more realistic because it is based on things that we know that basic learning algorithm can do and basic neurons can do. And altogether, they can be captured by a single parameter. We call it the chunking threshold or the chunking parameter. Now, why it is so important to adjust this chunking parameter? So, as we say, that why it must be adjusted for ecological condition. At the beginning, I told you that if the cleaner fish is choosing first the resident, okay, the visitor may go away. Okay, not always, but with some probability. But there are some cases when there are many clients in the rift, and another visitor will come. In these cases that are not very common, but it can happen, then the cleaner can go and move to the visitor, and then it can learn that R followed by V, and it gives you 2. So we said that this chunk is misleading, okay? The chunk of V is misleading, although it's happened rarely, but it actually, what the fish can learn is that the sequence RV is as good as the sequence VR, all right? So it creates a situation that we have a trade-off between under-chunking and over-chunking. On the one hand, you want to create chunk as soon as possible so you can learn to prefer the visitor. On the other hand, if you chunk too quickly, even the rare cases when this happened, but it's not happened every time. It's not something that you really want to learn, but it can be misleading, and you have the problem of over-chunking. Now, the idea that you have such a trade-off implies that you can have different optimal chunking parameter for different ecological conditions. And you can simulate, for example, what is the optimal chunking parameter? And I'm talking about optimal. Not every fish may get to the optimal. Okay, it depends how much experience they have and how much they need to learn. But even if they get to the optimal one, in different client density and different relative visitor frequency of visitors and client density of resident and visitors, you can have different level of optimal chunking parameter, like different thresholds for chunking. For example, if you take Yeah, and as a result, as a result of this optimal chunky parameter, you get what is the optimal possibility of solving the problem, what would be the visitor preference that emerge from under each possibility. For example, if you take this medium area when Clyde density is medium and you have both visitor and residents in the population, under this condition, for example, you can see that the frequency of creating chunks, most of the cases learning is going well. The VR, the good chunk, are learned, and the misleading chunk is learned in a very low probability. And indeed, in this case, the preference for the visitor is about 70%, which is good. But in some other cases, despite using a very high threshold to avoid overchunking, okay, they're still formed in high frequency, and as a result, there will be no preference for the visitor. So there is really kind of complicated trade-off. Another way to put it is actually to take all this optimal chunking parameter port and to plot them against the frequency of encountering resident and visitor pairs. And you can see that on the left side, where the frequency of encountering resident and visitor together is low, here low chunking parameter is better, like a low threshold is better, because it allows to learn the helpful VR chunk faster. Okay, but the risk of learning the misleading chunk, okay, the risk of overchunking is still low. So actually it is adaptive to use a low chunk, like to chunk very quickly. On the other end, on this area, okay, high CP is better to avoid overchunking, but it may not even be enough. Like in the black dots, it means that they even fail to develop preference despite it. Now, the implication for experimental work, when you think about animals that have to solve problems in this way, that let's imagine that you take to the lab 2 different cleaner fish that come from a bit slightly different ecological condition or different background, okay? Again, first, maybe they don't learn very well, so on. So there are many reasons why they will not perform as you expect. But even if you take 2 fish that use the optimal threshold chunky parameter in their habitat, in the lab, usually the way they do it is, they give them, they train them with 2 plates with different colors. They offer them, food, and they teach them that, the green one, if it's not served first, it will disappear. So they're really to learn which is the resident, which is the visitor, and the learning rate that they use is based on the chunking parameter they come from they had in the field or in the previous background. So the idea is that even optimal cleaners are expected to fail the test if their chunking parameters tune to different ecological conditions than the one that you use in the lab. So you may think that you have one clever cleaner fish and one stupid cleaner fish, but it's maybe really related in how their chunking parameters are finely tuned to the environment. So this example of the cleaner fish, you might say the essence of cleverness, at least for cleaner fish, is really kind of the fine-tuning of chunking parameter to ecological conditions, to the environment. And think about it, this is just a story about 2 chunks and a cleaner fish that we assume that it pay attention to all the clients. Okay, in the real situation, in many problems, in many other cognitive challenges, we have more than 2 chunks possible, maybe. And we have animals that may not, part of what makes this situation complicated is the frequency of stimuli in the environment is not necessarily the frequency of stimulus that come into the brain in terms of attentional mechanism, sensory mechanism. So all these attentional mechanism and parameter of chunking have to kind of co-evolve together, work and concentration. And when you think about, other problem solving, like, creative problem solving like this, it could be even more tricky to create this network to work properly. But maybe animals can do it. It's getting challenging, but this is my way of trying to make sense of the evolution of cognition. And thank you very much.